Hey everyone! Today we dive into the history of family life in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, in those times, family wasn't just a casual thing, it was everything. Family was at the heart of society, holding it together in the present, preserving traditions from the past, and ensuring that these customs were passed on to future generations. In fact, the structure of temples and even royal hierarchies was based on the family model. Scholars often call this family setup the oikos model, which is Greek for household management. The head of the family was usually the senior male, who had the job of providing for everyone. If the family was upper class, this might mean he owned land. For others, it meant he was the main provider. In extended families, the father was in charge, while the grandfather, if he was still around, would be considered a dependent. This structure even extended to the temple, where the god was the head, and the priests were essentially the household members. Even slaves, believe it or not, were viewed as part of this family unit, treated differently depending on their role within the family. Marriage was another key part of this family structure. Unlike today's romanticized views, marriages back then were arranged between the bride's father and the groom's father, with each family handling it as a serious contract. This was no casual affair. Everything had to follow strict traditions, from the engagement to the wedding feast and the bride moving into her new home. While some people did live together without marriage, those unions and any children from them didn't receive the same protection under the law. But even with these strict rules, families enjoyed life together too. They loved wrestling, hunting, board games, storytelling, music, and even had pets, mostly dogs, which were such a big deal that Mesopotamians may have been the first to invent dog collars. Family ties were so important in Mesopotamia that they even extended into the afterlife. People believed that having family to remember you and make offerings would mean a better afterlife. This belief that family continued to bring stability beyond death was also seen in other ancient cultures, like Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but it started here, with Mesopotamia being one of the earliest to emphasize family life this way. The family structure in ancient Mesopotamia was pretty recognizable. They had nuclear families, where parents and kids lived together, often alongside extended family like grandparents or cousins. The patriarch, or oldest male, was usually in charge of the whole clan, while each household had its own breadwinner, responsible for everyone under that roof, including servants or relatives who couldn't work. One big responsibility of the head of the household was arranging marriages, which was taken seriously. Love might have been part of the equation, but marriage was primarily a business deal meant to ensure social stability in future generations. These marriages often sealed business agreements, whether over land, water rights, or other mutual benefits. Once families agreed on a union, they followed a 5-step marriage process to make it official: an engagement contract, payment exchanges between families, the ceremony and feast, the bride moving in with her in-laws, and finally, consummation on the wedding night, with the hope of having children. And if anyone dared to break off an engagement, there were serious penalties. The groom who backed out lost his deposit. If the bride's father broke the contract, he had to repay double to the groom. These rules kept things in order and discouraged people from having a change of heart. Once married, the couple usually started life with the groom's family until they could set up their own home. Some, though, would stay in the same house as the groom's family, where the new bride would take on family responsibilities. And once a family in ancient Mesopotamia was ready to build a new home, every step had its own rituals, just like with marriage. Buying land was a serious commitment, usually sealed by a legal agreement with cylinder seals. And before construction started, families would pray to the gods Kapta and Mushtama. These two deities watched over every brick, every foundation, so people believed that ignoring them would only bring bad luck, maybe even a collapsed house. When construction wrapped up, another god, Arazu, who represented the finishing touch on a home, required offerings as thanks for blessing the structure and securing its future. Homes themselves were mostly made from the marsh plants and sun-dried brick, the affordable materials of the day. The wealthier families had sturdier options like baked brick, but this was costly and usually reserved for palaces and temples. For the everyday Mesopotamian home, windows were a luxury. Most houses stayed dark, with light filtering through sesame oil lamps or a roof hole above the hearth. Upper-class homes, if they could afford it, had wood-framed windows with reeds in place of glass. And every house had a single door, often painted red to keep out any bad spirits. More than one door was a risk, as it was thought that extra doors and windows might invite unwanted spirits or even ancestral ghosts inside. Once the family moved in, the father took his place as the head of the household, continuing a tradition that mirrored society's hierarchy. Just as the father held responsibility in the home, the king was considered the head of the household of the palace, taking care of his kingdom as his family. This role went back to legendary kings like Sargon of Akkad and Yor-Nammu, both of whom portrayed themselves as father figures for their people, prioritizing their subjects' well-being. In temples, this hierarchy took a spiritual turn. Each temple was seen as the home of a particular god or goddess, who owned not only the land and building but also any resources tied to it. The high priest or priestess served almost as a household manager, ensuring the god's or goddess's will was followed, much like how a family would honor their patriarch or a kingdom would respect the king. When it came to relationships, couples were generally expected to stay monogamous, resembling the bond between the king and the fertility deity to maintain the land's prosperity. That said, exceptions existed. Wealthier men could take on second wives or concubines, provided they could support them. Women, on the other hand, didn't have the same freedoms in this regard. A woman caught committing adultery faced severe punishment, while men didn't experience the same level of restriction. There were unique cases, though. If a man neglected his wife for male lovers, she had grounds for divorce. Same-sex relationships themselves weren't condemned unless they crossed social boundaries, like a relationship between people of different classes, as such intimacy was thought to disrupt the social order. It's clear, though, that making love was seen as just another natural part of life, much like eating, and was often celebrated openly in the culture. Women had a fair amount of rights compared to many other ancient societies. They could initiate a divorce under certain circumstances, own land, and run businesses. In fact, some of the first brewers were women, and there are records of women running taverns and even farms. However, if a woman left her husband without cause, the situation changed dramatically. She might be left on the streets, often with no other option than becoming a prostitute. Workdays started at sunrise and usually went until dusk, with the types of jobs depending heavily on social class. Lower-class folks might be bakers, farmers, or construction workers, while those in the upper class were often scribes, teachers, or military officers. Leisure time revolved around the family. Storytelling, which could even turn into dramatic performances, was popular, as were sports and music. Festivals were community-wide events that honored the gods and gave families a chance to celebrate together. Finally, death was yet another family-centered occasion. When someone passed away, the body was prepared at home by loved ones before burial. For the wealthier classes, this meant an elaborate tomb. For others, it was a simpler grave near the family home. The Mesopotamians had a pretty bleak view of the afterlife. No grand paradise awaited. Instead, spirits lived in a dark, dusty underworld ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. There they depended on the offerings made by the living, and a forgotten soul might even return to haunt their family if no one remembered them. To prevent this, families took care to honor their ancestors with rituals and offerings, ensuring their loved ones had some comfort in the next world. So, life in ancient Mesopotamia revolved around family, not just for everyday support, but even beyond the grave. Families kept traditions alive, cared for each other in life and death, and passed this dedication to the next generation.